Daniel pulled his thin coat tighter around his body, but the freezing wind cut through it like a knife. He sat on the pavement near the entrance of a small coffee shop, his back pressed against the cold brick wall. His fingers, red and stiff from the cold, curled around a small cardboard sign that read, "Hungry, anything helps." The city was alive around him. Pedestrians hurried past, bundled up in warm coats and scarves, their breath visible in the icy air. A woman rushed by, balancing a steaming coffee cup in one hand and her phone in the other. A group of teenagers laughed as they walked into the cafe, the smell of fresh pastries and brewed coffee spilling out every time the door opened. Daniel swallowed the dryness in his throat. It had been a rough night. No shelter had space for him, and the streets had offered little comfort. His stomach grumbled, but he ignored it. He was used to hunger. "Hey, Dan," came a voice from his right. He turned to see Mike, another homeless man, his face weathered from years on the street. He dropped down beside Daniel and held out a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in a napkin. "Found this in the trash behind the bakery. Still good," Mike said. Daniel hesitated, then took the sandwich. "Thanks, Mike. You sure you don't want the rest?" Mike shook his head. "Already ate. Besides, you look worse than me." Daniel managed a weak chuckle. "Yeah, well, I always did like the starving artist look." Mike grinned. "Some artist you are. Haven't seen you sketch in weeks." Daniel looked down at his empty hands. He used to draw, sketch the people that passed by, the city skyline, anything that kept his mind off the cold. But lately, even that felt impossible. The cafe door swung open and a barista stepped outside, tossing a bag into the trash. Her eyes met Daniel's for a moment before she turned back inside. Daniel sighed. He wasn't expecting sympathy. Most people didn't stop, didn't look. To them, he was invisible. A few minutes later, a well-dressed man in a sleek black coat stepped out of a taxi, adjusting his silver watch. He had an air of importance, the kind of presence that made people step aside without thinking. He walked briskly toward the cafe, talking on his phone. "Yeah, I'll be there in 10, just grabbing a coffee," the man said, distracted. As he pulled open the cafe door, something slipped from his pocket, a black leather wallet. It landed on the sidewalk without a sound. Daniel's eyes flicked to it. Mike nudged him. "Jackpot, man, that thing's probably full of cash." Daniel hesitated. His fingers twitched. It would be so easy. One quick move and he could have enough money for food, maybe even a cheap motel for the night. But then he shook his head. "That's not me," he muttered, pushing himself up. His legs were stiff, but he forced himself forward, grabbing the wallet before someone else did. He turned toward the cafe. The man was already inside, checking his phone as he stood in line. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped through the door. Warmth hit him instantly. The scent of coffee and fresh bread made his stomach ache even more. Conversations buzzed around him, but all he focused on was the man in the black coat. A barista looked at him warily. Sir, can I help you?" Daniel ignored her and approached the man. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rough from the cold. The businessman didn't turn at first. Then Daniel tapped his shoulder lightly. "Sir," he tried again. The man finally looked up, slightly irritated. "Yes?" Daniel held up the wallet. "You dropped this outside." The man blinked, his brows furrowing. He patted his pocket, realization dawning on his face. "Oh, wow, that could have been bad." He took the wallet and flipped it open, checking the contents. His expensive credit cards were still there. So was the thick stack of bills. "You didn't take anything?" he asked, a mix of surprise and skepticism. Daniel shook his head. "Not my money to take." The businessman studied him for a long moment. Then he exhaled, nodding. "Thank you, really." "No problem," Daniel said, already turning back toward the door. But before he could leave, the man reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Here," he said, holding it out, "for your honesty." Daniel glanced at the bill, then at the man. For a second, he considered refusing, but hunger gnawed at his insides. He swallowed his pride and took it. "Thanks," he said quietly. The businessman nodded once, then turned back to the counter. Within moments, Daniel was back outside, the warmth of the cafe already fading. Mike whistled. "Damn, Dan, you're a better man than me." Daniel smirked. "I try." He stuffed the bill into his pocket, already thinking of a hot meal, maybe even a clean pair of socks from the dollar store. As he sat back down, the wind picking up again, he didn't think much of the encounter. It was just another moment in the endless cycle of the city. What he didn't know was that his small act of honesty had set something in motion, something that would change his life forever. Daniel sat on the cold pavement, watching the city move around him. The $100 bill from the businessman had been a small relief. He had used it for a hot meal and some essentials, but now, 2 days later, he was back in the same spot, back to square one. The coffee shop door swung open and warm air rushed past him. A man in a thick coat stepped out, cradling a steaming cup in his hands. Daniel turned his gaze back to the sidewalk, not expecting anything from the world. Then movement caught his eye. A well-dressed man in a tailored navy suit was walking briskly down the sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear. His shoes clacked sharply against the pavement. He looked like the type of guy who had meetings scheduled down to the last second. As he reached the curb, something slipped from his pocket. A black leather wallet tumbled onto the sidewalk, unnoticed. The man kept walking, too busy with his call. Daniel's eyes locked onto the wallet. Mike, sitting beside him, nudged him with an elbow. "Well, would you look at that?" he muttered. Daniel didn't move. "That's gotta be loaded," Mike added. "You could eat good for a month, maybe get off the streets for a bit." Daniel exhaled slowly. The temptation was real, but he had made a choice long ago. He wouldn't take what wasn't his. He sighed, pushed himself up, and grabbed the wallet. "I'll be right back," he said. Mike just shook his head. "Man, you're something else." Daniel ignored him and jogged down the sidewalk, weaving through the crowd. The businessman was still on the phone, walking toward a taxi parked at the curb. "Sir!" Daniel called out, but his voice was drowned out by city noise. He pushed forward, moving faster. "Hey, excuse me!" The man finally turned, looking mildly annoyed. His sharp blue eyes flicked over Daniel's ragged appearance, and for a moment his expression hardened as if expecting a hassle. "You drop this," Daniel said, holding up the wallet. The businessman's gaze shifted, realization dawning. He patted his pockets, then let out a short breath. "Damn," he muttered before reaching for the wallet. He flipped it open and checked the contents. Daniel could see the thick wad of cash inside, easily a few $100s, maybe more. The businessman looked at him again, eyes narrowing slightly. "You didn't take anything?" Daniel shook his head. "No, sir." A pause, then a small, almost reluctant nod. "That's surprising." Daniel smirked. "Guess I'm full of surprises." The businessman studied him for another moment, then reached into the wallet and pulled out a $20 bill. "Here," he said, holding it out. Daniel looked at the money but didn't take it right away. "Go on," the businessman said, his tone softer now. "Buy yourself a meal." Daniel finally accepted the bill. "Thanks." The businessman nodded once, then turned toward his taxi. He was about to climb inside when something made him pause. He looked back at Daniel as if reconsidering something. "What's your name?" he asked. Daniel blinked. Most people didn't ask. "Daniel," he said. The man nodded. "Daniel, I'm James Thornton." Daniel nodded back. "Nice to meet you, James." James studied him for another second, then said, "Take care of yourself." With that, he slid into the taxi and the door shut behind him. Daniel watched as the vehicle pulled away into traffic. Mike whistled low as Daniel returned. "Man, you are the worst homeless guy I've ever met." Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, I'd rather be broke than be a thief." Mike snorted. Guess that's why you're still broke. Daniel didn't argue. He just sat back down, slipping the 20 into his pocket. It wasn't much, but it was something, and for some reason he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time he'd see James Thornton. The wind was brutal that morning, cutting through Daniel's thin coat as he sat on his usual spot outside the cafe. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, trying to hold on to whatever warmth he had left. Mike sat beside him, muttering under his breath. "You should have taken more than that 20. Bet that guy wouldn't have even noticed." Daniel smirked. "Yeah? And then what? Buy a hotel suite and retire?" Mike chuckled. "Nah, just a hot meal that ain't from a dumpster." Daniel didn't respond. He just watched the steady stream of people going in and out of the cafe. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods teased his senses, but he had long learned to ignore cravings he couldn't satisfy. Just then, the door to the cafe opened and someone stepped out. At first, Daniel didn't pay much attention until he heard a familiar voice. "Daniel?" He looked up. James Thornton stood in front of him, dressed in another expensive suit, this time a dark gray one. The businessman had a paper coffee cup in one hand and a brown bag in the other. His expression was a mix of recognition and curiosity. Daniel blinked. Hey." James glanced around, as if surprised to see him still here. "You come here often?" Daniel smirked. "Yeah, five-star dining at its finest." James chuckled. Then, without another word, he handed Daniel the brown bag. Daniel hesitated. "What's this?" "A breakfast sandwich. Figured you could use something warm." Mike leaned in. I wouldn't mind one too." James gave him a sideways glance but didn't respond. Daniel took the bag. "Thanks." James sipped his coffee. "You always been out here?" Daniel shrugged. "Not always. Life happens." James studied him for a moment, then made a decision. "Come inside with me." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Inside? The cafe?" James nodded. Daniel glanced at Mike, who just shrugged. "Look, I can eat out here just fine," Daniel said. "You don't have to." "Humor me," James interrupted. Daniel sighed. "All right, but if they throw me out, it's on you." James gestured for him to follow. As Daniel stood up and stepped inside, warmth immediately wrapped around him. It felt like stepping into another world. The cafe was cozy, filled with the hum of conversation and the hiss of steaming milk. People barely noticed as Daniel followed James to a booth near the window. A waiter approached, clearly hesitant when he saw Daniel's appearance. James didn't give him a chance to say anything. "2 coffees." The waiter nodded and hurried off. Daniel chuckled. "They're not used to guys like me in here." James leaned back. "I imagine not." For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, James set his coffee down. "Why'd you return my wallet?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Wouldn't most people." James smirked. "You know they wouldn't." Daniel exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "I don't know, just felt like the right thing to do." James studied him, tapping a finger against the coffee cup. "You ever had a job?" Daniel snorted. "Yeah, a lifetime ago." "What happened?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "Long story." James didn't push. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card. He slid it across the table. Daniel picked it up. It was a business card. James Thornton, CEO, Thornton Enterprises. Daniel whistled. "So you're a big deal." James shrugged. "Some would say." Daniel set the card down. "Why are you really doing this?" James smiled. "Because I believe in rewarding honesty." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" James leaned forward slightly. "It means, come by my office tomorrow. I might have something for you." Daniel blinked. "Something like a job." Daniel froze. James finished his coffee and stood. "Think about it." Then, with a small nod, he turned and walked out, leaving Daniel staring at the business card in his hand. Daniel stood outside the towering glass building of Thornton Enterprises, gripping the business card James had given him. The reflection in the glass doors showed his ragged clothes, unshaven face, and the doubt in his eyes. Maybe this was a mistake, he muttered. He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, a voice called out, "Mr. Thornton told me to expect you." Daniel looked up. A sharply dressed receptionist stood at the entrance, offering him a polite smile. Yeah, I guess I'm here," Daniel mumbled. "This way," she said, leading him inside. The lobby was sleek, polished floors, expensive chandeliers, and a quiet hum of efficiency. Daniel felt every set of eyes on him as he followed the receptionist to the elevator. He wasn't sure if they were judging him or just surprised to see someone like him there. The elevator ride was silent, except for the dinging of floors passing by. When the doors opened, they stepped into a bright office space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. James Thornton stood near his desk, glancing up as Daniel walked in. "Daniel," he greeted, motioning to a chair across from him. "Have a seat." Daniel hesitated before lowering himself onto the plush leather seat. James leaned forward. "Didn't think you'd show up." Daniel smirked. "Neither did I." James studied him for a moment. "You still haven't asked why I called you here." Daniel shrugged. "Figured you'd get to it." James smiled. "I want to offer you a job." Daniel blinked. "A job?" James nodded. "Nothing fancy, just an entry-level position. You'd start as a courier, handling internal deliveries, mail, small office tasks." Daniel shifted in his seat. "I don't even have a resume." James chuckled. "I don't need one. What I need is someone honest. You proved that when you returned my wallet." Daniel rubbed his jaw. "Why me? There's 100 guys who'd take this job in a heartbeat." James leaned back. "Because I believe in giving people chances." Daniel exhaled, tapping his fingers on the armrest. "What's the catch?" James raised an eyebrow. "No catch. You work, you get paid. Simple as that." Daniel hesitated. The thought of having a real job again, one that didn't involve scraping through garbage or sleeping in doorways, was overwhelming. James watched him. "If you're worried about what people will think, don't be. I've had employees from all walks of life. What matters is how you move forward." Daniel let out a breath. "What's the pay?" "Enough to get you off the streets." Daniel looked down at his hands, calloused and rough. He had spent years convinced no one would ever give him another chance, and yet here was a man willing to take a risk on him. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll do it." James extended a hand. "Welcome to Thornton Enterprises." Daniel hesitated for only a second before shaking it. His fingers were rough, James's grip firm. "For now," James said, pulling back. "Go downstairs to HR. They'll sort out your paperwork. And Daniel?" "Yeah?" James smiled. "You might want to think about a haircut." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, probably." As he walked out of the office, something inside him felt different, hopeful. For the first time in years, he had a chance to start over. Daniel adjusted the collar of his new work shirt, feeling the crispness against his neck. It had been years since he'd worn anything but worn-out clothes from charity bins. He stood in front of the mirror in the small bathroom of his new apartment, staring at himself. "Damn," he muttered. "I almost look like a regular guy." The apartment was nothing fancy. One room, a small kitchenette, and a bed that didn't have to be shared with the cold pavement, but to Daniel it felt like a palace. A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. He grabbed his employee badge from the counter and headed out, locking the door behind him. Daniel stepped into the Thornton Enterprises building, feeling the same nerves that had gripped him during his first visit. But this time he wasn't an outsider. He belonged here now. "Morning, Daniel," said Sarah, the receptionist, flashing him a smile. "Morning," he replied, trying to sound natural. He made his way to the courier station where his supervisor, Mark, handed him a clipboard. "All right, newbie," Mark said with a smirk. "Your job is simple. Deliver these packages, take documents where they need to go, and for the love of God, don't get lost." Daniel chuckled. "No promises." Mark laughed. "You'll do fine. Just stay out of the CEO's office unless you're called." Daniel smirked. I think I know the guy. Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. Get to work then. Daniel grabbed the stack of deliveries and memos, his first real task in years. By lunchtime, Daniel had settled into the rhythm of the job. He navigated the maze of hallways, exchanging nods with employees, making small talk with the security guard, and even joking with the break room staff. At one point, he passed by a group of employees chatting near the elevators. Hey, you're the new guy, right? One of them asked. Yeah, Daniel. I'm Jake. Welcome aboard, man. You used to work somewhere else before this? Daniel hesitated, then smirked. Something like that. They didn't press him for details, and for that he was grateful. At the end of the day, Daniel was stacking delivery slips when a familiar voice spoke behind him. How's the first day treating you? Daniel turned to see James Thornton, hands in his pockets, watching him with a knowing smile. I didn't break anything, Daniel said, so I'd call that a win. James chuckled. Good. Keep that streak going. Daniel nodded. A comfortable silence settled between them. Then James spoke again. Listen, Daniel, I didn't hire you out of pity. I hired you because I saw something in you, someone who refuses to give up, even when life gives him every reason to. Daniel swallowed, nodding. James continued, This isn't charity. It's a chance, and I know you'll make the most of it. Daniel exhaled slowly. I will. James clapped him on the shoulder. Good, now go home. You've got work tomorrow. Daniel smiled, looking forward to it. As he walked out of the building, a new feeling settled inside him. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. One act of kindness can change a life forever,